She picked up the receiver and dropped her voice half an octave before saying hello. Nobody wrote that rule down, so why did every woman in 1953 already know it? In post-war America, speech was never just speech. It was a costume you put on before you left the house, as deliberate as a hat or a pair of gloves. Etiquette writers of the era did not pretend otherwise. They wrote in plain print that a correct voice was evidence of good breeding. Your accent, your pitch, even your pauses told a stranger where you stood before you said a single word about yourself. Emily Post's etiquette had been in American homes since 1922, and by the 1950s it had gone through edition after edition, each one thicker with rules about how a lady should talk. She warned against a loud, nasal, or whining voice the same way she warned against a soiled tablecloth. It was a flaw. It was fixable. And every mother who owned the book made sure her daughter knew it. Amy Vanderbilt published her own complete book of etiquette in 1952, and it sold right alongside Post's on the same shelf in the same living rooms. Two rival authorities, both insisting on the same core idea. How you spoke to the milkman was not how you spoke to your husband's employer, and mixing the two up was a mistake a well-raised woman simply did not make. Here is the part nobody expects. The clipped, articulate voice you hear in every old newsreel was not how ordinary Americans actually talked. It was manufactured. NBC and CBS trained their announcers to strip out regional sound entirely, chasing something they called General American, a voice built to belong to no place in particular. That voice became the sound of authority, and everyone else quietly measured themselves against it. A linguist named John S. Kenyon worked directly with NBC on pronunciation standards, and in 1944 he co-authored a pronouncing dictionary that broadcasters kept on their desks like scripture. This was not a vague cultural drift. This was a deliberate, documented project to flatten the American voice into something that sounded educated to everyone, everywhere, all at once, no matter which region an announcer had actually grown up in. Before General American took hold, there was another accent entirely, one you have absolutely heard and probably assumed was real. The mid-Atlantic accent, the clipped, almost British sound in old Hollywood films, was invented, taught, drilled into actors at schools like the Fegan School of Dramatic Art in New York, one vowel at a time, until it sounded natural coming out of a mouth that had never once heard it at home. Katharine Hepburn spoke it. So did dozens of radio men whose real hometown accents you would never guess from listening to them on air. By the time television took over American living rooms in the 1950s, that stagey transatlantic sound was already fading, replaced by the newer, plainer General American standard. Even the proper voice of the era kept changing underneath people's feet. By 1950, roughly 6 in 10 American households had a telephone, up sharply from just before the war. That single object reshaped how people spoke more than almost anything else in the home. Early phone lines had a narrow, tinny frequency range. Consonants got clipped, so etiquette manuals coached a very specific telephone voice, slightly higher, carefully enunciated, nothing like your everyday kitchen table talk. Women especially were told to keep their voice low and well modulated on the phone, because a woman's naturally higher pitch could sound shrill and distorted through those early receivers. That was a real acoustic problem. But it got dressed up in etiquette books as a moral judgment about ladylike behavior, as if the wiring itself had opinions about who counted as refined. Think about what that meant in practice. A woman calling her sister used one voice. The same woman calling her husband's office used another, pitched higher and slower and stripped of any regional color. She was not lying. She was performing, the way an actress hits her mark, because the etiquette books had taught her that conversation itself was something on display. The rule was never written down as a formal law, but every woman in the room knew it. Speak plainly and warmly to family. Speak carefully and clearly to guests. Speak with quiet deference to your husband's employer. And never, under any circumstance, let the three voices blur together in front of company, or the whole performance would unravel in a single sentence. Class-coded speech showed up even in how people were addressed by name. A married woman was formally introduced using her husband's full name, Mrs. John Smith, never Mrs. Jane Smith. Household help, meanwhile, was addressed by first name only by the very same family, the help addressed as Mr. and Mrs. Emily Post described this asymmetry plainly, as simply how things were done. It sounds cold from here, and in some ways it was. But it also meant everyone in the room, regardless of station, knew precisely what was expected of them and precisely how to meet it. There was no ambiguity to navigate, no guessing whether a greeting was too familiar or too stiff. The rule did the guessing for you every single time, in every single house. Regional accents fared far worse than any of this. Southern drawls, thick New York City cadences, immigrant-inflected English, all of it faced open stigma in professional and broadcast settings. Later linguistic research would give this feeling a name: linguistic insecurity, the documented tendency of speakers to actively suppress their own natural accent in careful, formal conversation, especially when a stranger or a superior was listening closely. That research came later in the 1960s from a scholar named William Labov studying New York City speech. But the pressure he documented was not new to that decade. It was the scholarly confirmation of something etiquette books had been quietly coaching for 40 years already, dressed up as manners instead of what it really was, a class filter running underneath every conversation. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to teach anymore. Colleges in the 1950s commonly offered speech or voice and diction courses as electives, a direct leftover of the old elocution movement that had dominated American schooling since the 1880s. Students signed up the way they might sign up for typing. It was a practical skill, not an art form. Go back further, and the elocution movement itself is fascinating. From the 1880s through the 1910s, American grammar schools drilled posture, breath control, and dramatic recitation as a standard subject, right alongside arithmetic. Children stood at the front of the room and performed their sentences the way a soldier might present arms. Speech was treated as a discipline, not an accident of birth. By the time those elocution-trained grandparents raised 1950s parents, the formal school subject had faded, but the underlying belief never did. Correct speech was still treated as proof of upbringing. Your grandmother knew something they stopped passing down, and she absorbed it so thoroughly she probably never once thought of it as a rule. It was simply how a person spoke. War had scrambled all of this together first. During the Second World War, millions of Americans from wildly different regions were thrown into barracks and factories side by side, hearing accents they had never encountered outside a radio. It exposed people to each other on a scale nothing before it had, and it made an entire generation newly self-conscious about how they sounded once they came home. Nobody wanted to sound country. Nobody wanted to sound foreign. So when the men and women of that generation settled into new post-war suburbs, they brought a heightened awareness of speech with them, and it landed directly on their children. The push toward a neutral, placeless voice was not abstract. It was a family project, repeated at the dinner table night after night. Television made all of this louder. Around 9% of American households owned a television set in 1950. By the middle of the decade, that number had rocketed past 60%. Suddenly, the broadcast voice was not just something you heard on the radio while doing housework. It sat in the living room every evening, visible, dressed well, and impossibly composed. That visibility changed the stakes. A voice on the radio was invisible, judged on sound alone. A voice on television belonged to a face, a posture, a hairstyle, all working together as one package of respectability. Charm schools and finishing schools understood this instantly, and they built entire businesses around teaching ordinary young women to look and sound like the women on screen. The Catherine Gibbs schools trained young women in shorthand and typing, but just as seriously in posture, dress, and voice, because a secretary answering the office telephone was functionally the voice of the entire company. A single mispronounced word on a call could reflect on her employer. That was not an exaggeration. It was written into the curriculum, alongside shorthand speed and correct letter formatting. John Robert Powers built something similar, but bigger. He had founded the first modeling agency back in 1923, and by the 1950s, his network of finishing and charm schools stretched across dozens of American cities. He was not just training models. He was selling ordinary young women a new voice and a new posture, marketed as the ticket to sounding like a different class entirely. It disappeared from polite company, but it still works. This idea that voice is a tool you can consciously build rather than something fixed at birth. That was the real promise these schools were selling, and thousands of young women paid for it willingly because they understood something modern culture has mostly forgotten. Your voice was not fate. It was a skill you could practice. None of this was reserved for women alone, though the etiquette books marketed hardest to them. Men had their own version, delivered through business and sales training instead of charm school. Toastmasters, founded back in 1924, had grown steadily through the middle of the century, teaching executive diction and public speaking to men climbing the corporate ladder rung by rung. A salesman with a heavy regional accent was quietly steered toward speech coaching the same way a secretary was. The goal was identical across both sexes: sand down anything that sounded like a specific hometown and replace it with something that sounded, deliberately, like nowhere at all. That placeless voice was the entrance fee to a certain kind of American success. Children were folded into this system early, and the rules for them were even stricter. A child was taught never to interrupt adult conversation, to speak only when directly addressed by a grown guest, and to say sir and ma'am even to a family friend they had known their entire life. It was a whole separate register, a children's voice held apart from the adult one. That register was not permanent. It was a rehearsal for the one you would eventually be handed as an adult, and shedding it at the right moment was itself a marker of maturity. A young woman who still spoke like a child at 18 had failed to graduate into the voice her mother had been building toward her whole life. Emily Post herself is worth knowing as more than just a name on a book spine. She was born in 1872 into old New York money, went through a scandalous divorce at a time when divorce could ruin a woman socially, and rebuilt her entire public identity as America's arbiter of manners. She even hosted her own radio program in the 1930s, demonstrating in her own voice exactly the cadence she prescribed to millions of readers. That detail matters more than it first appears. The most influential etiquette voice in America was, quite literally, a broadcast voice. Post did not just write the rules down. She performed them, live, over the airwaves, so an entire nation could hear precisely what correct speech was supposed to sound like, straight from the source, in her own measured cadence. Amy Vanderbilt built her own version of that same reach. Despite the name, she was not directly related to the famous Vanderbilt family, though the association certainly did not hurt her book sales. She turned her etiquette expertise into a syndicated newspaper column and later television appearances, extending her rival authority right into the same American households Post had already claimed. It disappeared from polite company, but it still works, and here is the exact moment you can watch it disappearing. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, elocution and voice and diction courses gradually vanished from American college catalogs. In their place came speech communication, a field built around self-expression rather than correctness. The class-coded voice did not get abolished. It simply stopped being taught out loud. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to teach anymore. And this is exactly what got lost when elocution faded from classrooms. Not the class snobbery attached to it, which deserved to go, but the underlying idea that speech was a craft worth deliberately practicing, the same way you might practice penmanship or posture instead of something you simply were stuck with. Consider how deliberately layered a single 1950s conversation could be. A hostess greeting guests at her front door used her warmest, most formal register. 10 minutes later, correcting a child in the kitchen, her voice dropped into something plainer and firmer. And answering the telephone in between, she reached for that careful, higher, well-modulated tone the manuals had trained into her. 3 distinct voices, all coming from the same woman, all deployed within a single evening without a moment's hesitation. That is not exaggeration or nostalgia talking. That is what etiquette manuals of the era openly described as basic competence, the unremarkable skill set every well-raised woman was simply expected to carry into any room she happened to enter that day. It is worth pausing on the acoustic reason behind so much of this, because it is easy to assume the whole system was pure snobbery. Early telephone lines genuinely clipped frequencies, genuinely distorted higher pitches, genuinely made fast or mumbled speech unintelligible. The advice to slow down and enunciate on a call was, at its root, sound engineering. The class judgment got layered on top of a real technical limitation. That is a detail worth holding on to because it changes the story slightly. Not every rule in these manuals was pure class performance. Some of it was genuinely practical guidance dressed in etiquette language, because etiquette language was simply how instructions traveled through 1950s American households. Even good, sensible advice arrived, wearing the costume of a class rule, whether it needed to or not. But most of it was not practical at all. Most of it was pure signaling, a way of sorting people at a glance, or rather at a sound. And nowhere was that sorting sharper than in how a woman was expected to modulate her volume and vocabulary, depending entirely on who was standing directly in front of her that moment. Amy Vanderbilt's book addressed this head-on, coaching readers on adjusting their vocabulary and volume for household help, for business superiors, and for social equals, as 3 entirely separate categories requiring 3 entirely separate approaches. Code switching, in other words, decades before that phrase existed, taught as openly and matter-of-factly as folding a dinner napkin correctly for a formal table setting. This is the part modern etiquette culture almost never talks about, because it makes people uncomfortable, and understandably so. But pretending it did not happen does not make it more honest. It just makes the whole picture flatter, when the truth is that 1950s speech was a genuinely sophisticated, genuinely conscious social technology, even when it served an unequal purpose. Your grandmother knew something they stopped passing down, and it was not just which fork to use. It was the understanding that her voice, in any given room, was a choice she was making on purpose, not an accident she was stuck defending. That kind of conscious control over your own presentation is a genuinely useful thing to lose sight of, and most of us have. Think about the sheer amount of infrastructure built around this single idea. Etiquette bestsellers selling in the hundreds of thousands of copies. Radio and television networks with formal pronunciation departments. College speech electives. Charm schools in dozens of cities. Dedicated finishing programs for secretaries. An entire economy existed just to teach Americans how to sound like a slightly different version of themselves. It is easy to look at that infrastructure now and call it excessive. And in some ways it was. But it also meant Americans of that era took the craft of speaking seriously in a way that feels almost foreign today, when most people assume their voice is simply fixed, something you are handed at birth rather than something you can shape. Consider a young secretary from a small Midwestern town, arriving in a city like Chicago or Cleveland for her first office job in 1954. She had likely never heard General American spoken as a native voice in her own home. She learned it, deliberately at her Gibbs school desk, practicing dictation phrases until the rounded, placeless vowels stopped feeling foreign in her own mouth. That is not a small thing to ask of a person. It meant quietly setting aside the sound of her own mother's voice, the sound of her own childhood kitchen, in exchange for a voice built by radio engineers and etiquette writers who had never set foot in her hometown. She did it anyway because the reward on the other side, real employment, real independence, was worth the trade. It disappeared from polite company, but it still works, and this is the exact bargain modern people still quietly make, just without the vocabulary to name it. A job interview voice, a first date voice, a meeting the in-laws voice. We all still code switch constantly. We simply stopped admitting it was a skill and started pretending it happens naturally, without effort or intention. There is real irony sitting underneath all of this. The very rules meant to enforce class distinction eventually became available to anyone willing to buy a book or pay for a course. Emily Post's readers were not exclusively old money. They were secretaries, shop clerks, and young brides from ordinary backgrounds, all reaching for the same manual, all using it as a genuine tool for upward mobility. That is the part worth defending against modern cynicism. Yes, the system sorted people by voice, but it also handed ordinary Americans a genuinely usable set of instructions for climbing it, printed in plain English, sold for a modest price, available at any bookstore in the country. Nobody had to be born knowing the rules. They could simply be learned. Compare that to today, when so much social judgment happens instantly and silently, based on an accent or a word choice, with no manual anywhere handing you the rules of the room you just walked into. At least the 1950s system, unequal as it was, told you plainly what it wanted from you. Today's version mostly just judges and leaves you to guess why. Good manners remember, even when we forget. And this is exactly the kind of remembering worth doing, not to bring back the class judgment baked into it, but to bring back the underlying respect for the listener. Speaking clearly, speaking warmly, adjusting your tone to the room you are actually in, that was never really about superiority. At its best, it was about consideration. A well-modulated voice on the phone was, underneath the class anxiety, simply a courtesy to the person straining to hear you through a bad connection. A careful, warm greeting at the front door was simply a way of making a guest feel expected and welcome the second they crossed the threshold. Strip away the snobbery, and what is left underneath is not nothing. It is real thoughtfulness. It is worth asking what happened to that thoughtfulness once the formal rules disappeared. Elocution left the classroom. Charm schools closed their doors one by one through the 1960s and 70s as the culture shifted toward authenticity and self-expression as the highest social value. And with that shift came something genuinely good: more freedom, less forced conformity, fewer people made to feel ashamed of their hometown voice. But something else went out the door with all that forced conformity, and it is harder to name. The deliberate, practiced attentiveness that used to go into how you addressed a stranger, how you softened your tone for a nervous guest, how you consciously matched your speech to the person standing in front of you. That effort quietly stopped being taught anywhere at all. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to teach anymore, and voice sits right at the center of it. We assume today that how we sound is simply who we are, fixed and unchangeable, when the entire post-war generation understood the opposite. Voice was a craft. Voice could be shaped on purpose toward whatever version of yourself you were trying to become. Interestingly enough, this exact impulse has quietly resurfaced today, just wearing entirely different clothes. Across social media, creators now teach so-called old money diction, or a certain aspirational British-inflected cadence, chasing precisely the same class signaling that Emily Post codified a century ago, most of them with no idea they are repeating a very old American pattern all over again. The platforms changed. TikTok and YouTube stood in for the charm school, and a ring light stood in for the studio mirror. The instinct underneath stayed exactly the same, the very human desire to sound like the version of yourself you are hoping to become, dressed up now in different branding but running on the identical engine that once powered Katharine Gibbs' classrooms 70 years earlier. Researchers studying accent bias in hiring and broadcasting have kept finding the same underlying pattern for decades now, that a certain kind of neutral, educated-sounding voice still opens doors in ways a strong regional or working-class accent does not. The overt institutions vanished. The bias, quietly, did not, and it still shapes callbacks, promotions, and even courtroom outcomes across the country today. That is the uncomfortable thread connecting 1953 to right now. The overt charm school closed. The formal elocution class disappeared from the catalog. But the underlying test, does your voice sound like it belongs in this room, never actually stopped being administered. It simply stopped announcing itself out loud the way it once did, decade after quiet, unannounced decade of change. Picture that young secretary from Cleveland one more time years later, now training a new girl fresh off the train herself. She passes down the same telephone posture, the same careful pitch, the same warm but measured greeting, not because a manual told her to this time, but because it had become simply who she was. The rule had disappeared into instinct. That is what a genuinely well-taught rule looks like at its very best. It stops feeling like a rule at all. It becomes a form of care so automatic you forget it was ever consciously learned in the first place, passed from one woman to the next like a family recipe, refined a little more with every hand that touched it. It is tempting to romanticize all of this completely. And Nancy, you already know better than to fall for that trap. The class filtering baked into 1950s speech genuinely harmed people. It punished honest regional voices. It made countless Americans feel small for sounding like where they actually came from. That part deserves no defense at all, and it gets none here. But the craft itself, the plain idea that speech deserves deliberate practice, that a voice can be shaped with the same care you would give a garden or a recipe, that part was never the problem. It was the class gatekeeping wrapped around it that did the damage. And somewhere along the way, we threw out the whole practice instead of just the gatekeeping. That distinction matters enormously if you actually sit with it. You can absolutely keep the discipline, the intention, the practiced warmth in how you speak to a stranger without keeping a single trace of the ugly sorting mechanism that once rode alongside it. The two were never actually the same thing. History just happened to bundle them together for a few crowded decades. So what do you actually keep, sitting here decades later with a cup of tea and none of the pressure your grandmother carried? You keep the telephone voice, minus the class panic behind it, because slowing down and speaking clearly for someone straining to hear you is simply decent. You keep the deliberate warmth at the front door, because a guest still deserves to feel expected. You keep the idea that your voice is a choice you are actively making in any given room, not a fixed accident you are stuck defending. And you quietly let go of the idea that any single accent, any single cadence, was ever the correct one to begin with. That was always the lie sitting underneath the whole system, however politely it was dressed. It disappeared from polite company, but it still works, one final time, because this is genuinely the through line of the entire story. The specific rules faded, the instinct underneath them, that speech is worth practicing, worth caring about, worth deliberately shaping for the person in front of you. That instinct is still exactly as useful today as it was standing at a 1953 hallway telephone table. Somewhere along the way, modern culture decided that caring about how you sound was fake, was performance, was somehow less honest than just letting whatever comes out of your mouth come out unfiltered. But your grandmother would have found that idea a little strange. To her, caring how you sounded to someone else was not the opposite of honesty. It was simply respect, spoken out loud. Think back to where we started, that woman lowering her voice before she even said hello. She was not performing dishonesty. She was performing care, deliberately, for a person on the other end of the line she could not even see. That single small adjustment carried an entire inherited world of instruction behind it, most of which she probably could not have explained if you had asked her directly. That is the real answer to the question this video opened with. Everyone spoke differently in the 1950s, not because there was one single correct voice everyone was chasing, but because an entire generation had been taught, deliberately and thoroughly, that voice itself was worth shaping on purpose. It was not vanity. It was, at its root, a discipline of attention toward other people. Good manners remember, even when we forget. And that is exactly the invitation sitting at the end of this one. You do not need a charm school membership or an etiquette bestseller to bring back the part worth keeping. Just the next time you pick up the phone, slow down half a beat and let your voice do what it was always meant to do. Make the person on the other end feel heard. If this took you back to your own grandmother's hallway table or made you hear your mother's telephone voice in your head for the first time in years, tell me about it below. And if you want more of these forgotten rules, the ones nobody wrote down but every woman in the room simply knew, stay close. There is always another one waiting to be remembered.